I'm William Johnson. Okay. Good evening once again. I'm William Johnson, Chair of the Baltimore County Blue Ribbon Commission on Ethics and Accountability. It's my pleasure to welcome my fellow commissioners and members of the public who are viewing the session to this meeting of the Baltimore County Blue Ribbon Commission on Ethics and Accountability. During this meeting, we will hear from the Schaefer Center for Public Policy about the findings from both the Ethical Climate Survey and the Best Practices Research. And we won't give you an update on our subcommittees, but we will acknowledge the work that's being done by our subcommittee. And so before we get started, I would like to share a few housekeeping items. First of all, this session is being recorded. The agenda for tonight's meeting was shared with the members of the commission directly, and it's posted on the commission's website, and that is www.blueribbonethics.ubalt.edu. The meeting is scheduled to conclude at 8:30. If we cover the agenda items before then, the meeting will close early. All agendas, minutes, meeting links, and commission materials will be posted on the commission's website. We will not be responding to comments or questions posted in the chat. If you have questions or comments that you would like to share after the meeting, you may do so by emailing the commission at blueribbonethics@ubalt.edu. There are times during tonight's meeting when commission members will have the opportunity to ask questions or comment. If you're on camera, please simply raise your hand to indicate that you have a comment or question, and I will acknowledge you. And of course, if you're off camera, please use the raise hand function in Zoom. So that being said, our first order of business is to review the minutes of the previous meeting. And those minutes were provided to commission members by email this week. And so I just need to find out whether or not commission members have any comments or changes to the drafted minutes.
None from me.
Okay. Okay. So if there are no corrections or changes, can I have a motion to approve the minutes?
I move to approve.
Okay, and a second?
Second.
Okay, thank you. So we have a motion to approve and we have seconds. Therefore, the minutes are approved as distributed. Thank you very much. And so tonight, as mentioned earlier, we have two presentations. The first presentation being findings of Ethical Climate Survey, and that will be presented by Dr. Ann Cotton, the director of the Schaefer Center for Public Policy. And so I will turn it over to you at this point, Dr. Cotton. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We'll wait for our slides to come up. There we go. So tonight we're going to present the findings of the Ethical Climate Survey that was conducted in July of this year. The survey itself, the survey instrument, the members of the commission had the opportunity to review, and we also shared the instrument with the Inspector General for comment. The final survey was distributed via Qualtrics, which is our online web-based surveying platform, by email. All the county employees and board and commission members received a pre-survey message from the county administrative officer informing them about the survey. On July 11th, the survey opened and participants received multiple emails from the Schaefer Center until they completed the survey or until the survey closed on July 25th. We had 19% of the respondents participate. That's 1,470 people that provided over 70% of the answers to 70% of respondents provided 90% of the answers to the question. So basically, we're saying is that we have a good response rate and there was good participation. The respondents, as would be expected, most of them were agency employees. 95% were agency employees, 2% board and commission members, 1% elected officials, and 1% didn't indicate. The respondents could have picked more than one category if they were in more than one category. And the highest group of respondents were police, which was 21%, fire, which had 13%, and health, which is 12%. Most of the respondents were not required, the 62% indicated they were not required to complete an annual ethics disclosure, the financial disclosure, and half had worked for the county for 10 years. And of those, half had been in their current position for 10 years. So when asked if the respondents were asked if they had reported suspected cases of fraud, waste, abuse, or ethical misconduct in the past 4 years, and 86% said no. And of that, 3% reported suspected ethical misconduct, 2% reported suspected fraud, waste, or abuse, and 1% reported 2% reported both ethical misconduct and fraud, waste, or abuse, and 1% reported fraud, waste, or abuse, and 8% didn't answer the question. And that's something we'll see a lot in the survey. A number of the questions were left blank or were skipped. And that's an indication that people may not feel comfortable answering some of the questions. So when asked who of those who said they reported suspected ethical misconduct, we asked who they reported that to, and 62% reported it to their agency leadership. And respondents could have picked more than one entity to have reported to. 30% reported to the Inspector General, 25% to Human Resources, 18% to Bargaining Unit, 6% to Ethics Commission, and 2% to the Auditor. So after agency leadership, the Office of Inspector General received the most reports. We also asked when making the report if respondents used legal counsel, and 64% of the respondents indicated that they did not use legal counsel. Of those who did use legal counsel, 9% used a personal lawyer, 7% used the union or union's legal representative, and they used them 38% of the time before making the report, 63% of the time after making the report, 31% of the time they had them review the report, and 6% said preferred not to say. We asked participants if it became known whether or not they had reported the incident. Most respondents were generally not worried about reporting whether or not if the reporting had become known. And 69% said that the report had become known. And most of those people actually reported it themselves. So they told their supervisor, they told their supervisor or the agency doing the inspection reported about the issue. And we asked if they faced a hostile work environment, and 48% said that they did not, and 37% that said that they did. Oh, can you get back for 1 second, Sarah? For the hostile work environment, 2/3 of the respondents said that experienced a hostile work environment, experienced that from their supervisor. 1/3 said it came from their agency leadership, and 1/3 said it came from coworkers. Thanks, we can go on. When asked about how satisfied they were with how their report of suspected misconduct was handled, more than half said they were not satisfied. And 11% said they prefer not to say, and 9% didn't answer. So almost as many that were satisfied said wouldn't answer the question. So of those who did not report, we asked them how they thought a report would be handled. And generally we asked the percent that said it would be likely or very likely that the report would be, and taken seriously, that the factors that led to the issue would be addressed, that their privacy would be maintained, that the report would be handled fairly, and it would be reported to investigators as appropriate. So the majority of respondents thought that it would be handled well. And they thought it would be taken seriously and that the issues would be addressed. And there's not much variation between the Office of Inspector General, the Ethics Commission, and the Auditor. So generally people have confidence that it would be handled well. And of those who didn't say likely or very likely, a large percentage of the responses were neutral. Respondents were more mixed about how they thought other people would react. So about a third thought that the person would be labeled as a troublemaker, that the alleged offender's colleagues would try to get back at the person making the report, or others would have a hard time supporting the person that making the report. And about 25% thought were neutral on these, and about 20% didn't have an opinion on that. So we asked people about their involvement in investigations, ethical investigations, to reports of misconduct or suspected fraud, waste, or abuse. So 88% of the respondents said that they didn't report fraud, waste, abuse, or suspected misconduct. That means 12.9%, I'm sorry, 12% had reported. And of those that reported, they reported to the Office of Inspector General, the auditor, the Ethics Commission. So mostly with the Office of Inspector General, but generally low numbers there. And we asked them to comment on their most recent investigation they were part of. 60% had been involved in an investigation with the Office of Inspector General, 16% with the Ethics Commission, and 21% with the auditor. And when we asked them what their type of involvement was, and most were either interviewed or provided documentation or answered questions. So 52% were interviewed, 43% provided documentation, and 22% provided written answers. So we also asked the respondents what type of information they received at the start of their involvement with the investigation. So the choices were when they first reached out to report, or the second choice is at the start of an interview or a meeting, and then the third was no, and then I don't know and prefer not to say. So when asked about the subject, being told about the subject of the investigation, 44% were told as soon as they were contacted. Another 13% were told at the beginning of an investigation. When we asked about policies and procedures, 16% were told at the outset of when they were first contacted, and 25% when the interview or meeting started. And then important questions come up about respondents' rights. 8% were told at the outset when they were first contacted, and a third were told at the beginning of the interview. And then another third don't remember, so they said they didn't receive, or another third didn't receive that information, and the remainder either didn't remember or preferred not to say. The majority of the respondents said that their supervisor knew of their involvement, and this is because mostly the respondent told their supervisor. So 48% told their supervisor, 6% had the investigative agency tell their agency leadership, and 17% said their supervisor wasn't aware. And of those who were actually involved in an investigation, we asked whether they used legal representation. So the vast majority, 79%, said no. 6% contacted a personal lawyer, and then another 2% contacted a union representative or the union's counsel. So we asked about the interaction and how those interactions were characterized, how they would characterize as interactions. So most either were comfortable with the interaction or neutral. So 44% were comfortable, 22% were neutral. 19% were uncomfortable with that interaction. When we asked about the investigator or the person contacting them from the investigatory agency, most thought they were prepared, professional, and knowledgeable. And a very small percentage said that they were not. We also asked if people felt threatened or intimidated during the interview process, and the vast majority, 83%, said no. A small proportion, 10%, said that they did feel threatened or physically intimidated, and 8% said provided no answer. And most people did not experience retribution or hostile work environment as a result of reporting suspected ethical misconduct. And of those who, sorry, most didn't experience retribution. And of those who did, 21% were most concerned about the reaction of their agency leadership. So we also asked participants about ethical issues and where they would go for advice if they had an ethical quandary, types of ethical issues they faced. So we had an open-ended question asking about the most common ethical issues that respondents encountered. So the issues broke down into major categories in working conditions, conflict of interest, discrimination, abuse of authority, lack of accountability, fraud and waste, and then other. And the working conditions included bullying, harassment, other actions that create a hostile work environment, issues related to compensation and benefits, concerns about confidentiality and privacy, and issues with the administration or leadership. And the most common response for conflict of interest was concerns about nepotism. We also asked respondents if they sought advice if they faced an ethical quandary. So 40% said they hadn't faced an ethical quandary or ethical issue. 15% said they did seek advice, and 9% faced an issue but did not seek advice. And we had 19% that didn't provide an answer and 7% that preferred not to say. So this is of the 40% who, I'm sorry, and the 15% who did have an issue for which they sought advice. The most common place they went for advice was to their agency leadership, followed by their coworkers or family and friends. 10%, only 10% went to the Office of Inspector General, and a smaller percentage, 6%, went to the Ethics Commission. Of those who went to the Ethics Commission and Office Inspector General, we asked how helpful the advice was. 65% thought that the Office of Inspector General was helpful. That's on the left side. The Office of Inspector General was helpful, and 31% somewhat helpful, and the Ethics Commission slightly less. It's 57% saying it was helpful, and 29% saying somewhat helpful. So we asked if contacting someone for advice, whether that actually helped resolve their issue. And 50% said no, and 49% said yes. So it's pretty much a mixed bag about whether actually contacting someone helped them.
Anne, it's John. Can I ask you a quick question, please? I know you mentioned earlier a number of respondents. What was the gross number of respondents? Was it 1,400 or something?
1,470, I believe.
Obviously, different people choose to answer different questions. So I just noticed, if you go back maybe one slide, is that N equal the number of respondents to that
yes,
question?
so this is the number of respondents. This is 23 and 14. And the reason that they're so small, this is of the people, of the 15% that
right.
said that they sought advice, and then that smaller percentage that contacted the Office of Inspector General or the Ethics Commission. So we're talking about a very small group. We didn't include the auditor because there were too few to make any statement.
Okay. I mean, I do understand why those numbers are so small. I'm just trying to get a feel for, you know, at what point the number dips, and but okay, let's keep going. Thank you.
Yeah, but I think your point is correct. I mean, there's really not a lot of responses here, so there's not a lot to say about this. For a specific small group, I think is your point is well taken. So
I'm sorry, Anne, is it easy to do just a quick summary, not now, of course, but in follow-up of the N, if you will, for each question in the survey?
Yes, we'll definitely can include that in the final version of our report. I
recognize that some are small because necessarily, if you didn't do the thing that makes the question relevant, you can't answer the question. But there's probably also a certain amount of fall off for other reasons, and it might just be useful to see what the sample size is in each of these questions when we.
Yeah, so we'll provide. I'm sorry, when we'll provide out the full report, we can have the ends in there for each of the questions.
All right, thank you.
You're welcome. So we asked people why they didn't use resources, and the largest reason is the lack of information. People weren't aware of the office. They didn't know how to contact the office. So respondents were allowed to select more than one in this question, so it's a mark all that apply. But almost a third said they weren't aware of the offices, and then there were concerns about confidentiality, afraid they would get in trouble, or not confident that they would receive useful advice, or confident they could handle. And then 16% were confident they could handle this on their own. So there is an opportunity there to increase awareness. So we asked respondents about the ethical climate in general of their agency. And we had 13 statements. We asked them 13 positive statements and 6 negative statements in their level of agreement to kind of get an assessment of how ethical they thought the climate was for their organization. So this graph represents the 13 statements that were positive and the level of agreement. So 1 is agree, 5 is disagree, and 3 in the middle is neutral. So the lowest score was employees or members seek advice within the agency when an ethical issue arises. And then the highest score is employees who report misconduct are not retaliated against. So basically what this bar is showing is the average score for each of those questions. And it's showing that the responses were generally neutral or lean positive. So the environment is generally neutral or positive with regard to positive statements about ethics. And we have the data for all the questions. We have that so you can actually see each of the questions, but this is just to give a general indicator of the climate. And then these are the negative questions. So the negative statements rather. So leadership usually does not pay attention to ethics. That was 3.6. So here the agree is negative and disagree is positive. So they're basically saying that leaning towards disagreeing with a statement that leadership doesn't pay attention to ethics. And then 2.7 is the average score of employees are expected to do as they're told no matter what. So basically these two charts together indicate that the ethical climate is neutral to generally positive. And then we can go into the next one, Sarah. So in this chart, we took all those responses to those 19 questions and coded them so they were all going in the same direction, and then looked at and plotted them here. So you can see it, the band is showing for each agency, whether it's the employees considered generally ethical, neutral, or unethical. And this middle number 3 is neutral. So you can see they're tending generally positive. And for some questions, there's a wider range. Like for planning, it has a wider range in the responses. Others are smaller, like fire, health, the ranges are a little bit smaller. So aging, the executive office, human resources, planning are places that are generally considered where employees consider their organizations to be the most ethical. So we also asked them about the county in general, so Baltimore County employees in general, not just their agency. And generally, these were statements about negative conduct and unethical conduct. So improperly accepting payment for doing government job outside of their, from people outside the government, engaging in inappropriate political activity, improperly benefiting financially, improperly accepting gifts, misusing time and resources for political activity, misusing government property, positions, or official time. So generally, people are saying never or occasionally they're seeing this in the county. This is generally leaning towards the positive. The most common types of most frequent unethical conduct, and that's 18 to 11%, is misusing official time, positions, or property. We also asked respondents open-ended questions about what they thought would help employees act more ethically, and then those responses were all coded. So they group into policies and procedures, which 46%, accountability, 38%, working conditions, and then have cultural structural change, 5%, and then improved transparency is 3%. So under policies and procedures, respondents mentioned training, reinforcement, continued education for employees, and clear policies and procedures and expectations. And then under accountability, this was really about accountability for leadership. And then we asked people what made it difficult to act ethically, in their opinion. This was also an open-ended question where they could respond as they wanted, and then these questions were coded into categories. So the responses were coded into categories. So a lack of understanding, office culture, and leadership were some of the main factors that make it difficult to act ethically, followed by personal culture and fear of ramifications. So the lack of understanding is a general awareness of ethical policies and behaviors. And then office culture focused on a distrust of management, a lack of resource and politics. And then personal culture was people being unconcerned with ethical guidelines or working for personal gain. And we asked them about their general comments. It was open-ended. What else would you like to tell us about the ethical climate in your organization? And accountability was the largest group. These were also open-ended that were coded into groups. So 6% responded with an issue relating to accountability. That's county leadership or managers, supervisors, and departmental oversight. And followed by working conditions, which was retaliation, intimidation, or lack of anonymity, followed by policies and procedures, which was 22%. We also asked respondents about their familiarity with ethics agencies and the ethics law for the county. So the responses range from very familiar on the left, somewhat familiar, and then the green is not at all familiar. So people are familiar with the Ethics Commission, somewhat familiar. So we have 56% that are either very familiar or somewhat familiar with the Ethics Commission. A little bit less for the Office of Inspector General at 53% being very familiar or somewhat familiar. The public ethics law, 51% familiar or very familiar or somewhat familiar. And an auditor at 41%. And the Blue Ribbon Commission came in at 31%. About half of the respondents found that the ethics law was useful in providing guidance for dealing with ethical issues. 12% thought it was not at all useful, and 28% responded that they didn't know. We also asked respondents about their attending ethics training. So can you click one more time, sir? There you go. Or they attended ethics training. So 36% said they attended within the last year, another 9% within the last 2 years, and 3% more than 2 years ago. 25% said they didn't attend, and another 19% said they didn't remember or they didn't know if they attended. 30% of those who did attend thought it was very useful, and another 54% somewhat useful. That's a conclusion of the survey. Then this is a high-level presentation of it. We have a detailed report, and then we'll also provide detail with all the responses, the frequency distribution with the ends for all the questions.
And John, again, may I, Mr. Chairman, may I ask a question?
You may.
I guess this almost sounds like combining the two halves of this evening's presentations, but how do you think we should evaluate the survey responses? Meaning, I don't know whether 54% matters or it has to be 75% before it matters. There's a lot of grouping around the mean or the middle, and so obviously I'm not a statistician or a data analyst. I don't expect to become one. I guess I'm wondering how we think we should, is there something in here that we should be focusing on? And I guess my question to you specifically is there anything that you think we should be focusing on? The reason I say it combines best practice a little bit is because trying to evaluate these numbers versus the numbers you would get if you did the same survey in any jurisdiction in the United States of America, how do we know if they're anomalous? And obviously, you can't go out and find this survey data for other jurisdictions to compare, but it's just hard for me to sort out what I'm seeing and how concerned I should be about something that might be statistically common or irrelevant or something else.
Actually, I think that's a really great question, John. And the survey serves a couple of purposes. One is to point out whether or not there are any major issues going on that are significant. And it doesn't really seem like that's the case, that we didn't see a lot of people that were saying that we're not seeing a huge undercurrent of unethical behavior that people are reporting. One of the biggest benefits of this type of survey is it's serving as a baseline, because this type of work hasn't been done before. So it's a way to assess progress going forward, to see whether or not the county is getting better, getting worse, and it just provides a barometer to kind of check what's going on in the county. And when we look at the different agencies, one thing you would do is look to see if any of the agencies are particularly standing out as being having people saying that they have significant ethical issues. And that's an opportunity to look at that and see if there's anything there. And it doesn't seem like anything stands out in particular. I think that this is really designed to provide a baseline about what's going on in the perceptions that the county employees and commission members have about this. And I think once we do, we'll include some more analysis on the ends, and that'll give us a little bit more clarity about who's the drop off, as you were talking about, who those people are,
right,
and to see if there's actually something significant about who's not responding.
Yeah, well, look, I know there's really no obvious easy answer to that question without probably doing a whole nother, study. But, for example, when you're comparing, what I wouldn't want to have happen when you're talking generically about the county, the numbers are one thing, but you just mentioned, for example, there's a chart that has every major county agency. So I don't know whether, I want to say it has something to do with standard deviations, but that's probably made up. I always feel like if I don't know what it is, it has something to do with standard deviations in statistics. So, but you have these bars, some are bigger and some are wider and some are narrower. So I don't want the director of fill in the blank to feel, my God, I have real ethical problems in my agency. Or on the other hand, for someone to feel like they have no issues in their agency, particularly, for example, I'd want to know the end. Like if the agency has 50 people and 2 responded, I don't know you can conclude anything from that, right? It's just 2 people who responded, or 3 people, whatever it might be. So your point about a baseline is terrific. Like if ultimately this is a report that is done on an annual, biannual, whatever cycle, I totally understand how it becomes a baseline for future studies. That makes great sense to me. It's just hard for me to process how to do anything with this information in terms of the immediate task at hand.
I think part of the immediate task at hand is we look at how people react to the experience of being part of an investigation with the Inspector General, with the auditor, with the Ethics Commission. I think that's important information, because one of the things that we were looking at is whether or not there's concern, what type of concern there is that people have about those experiences. I think that tells us a lot there. I also think that you're right, and the end matters, and reporting that will be important. So we'll go ahead and make sure that we do that.
Yeah.
And I also think that it tells us that even though from what the Inspector General said, everyone had to attend training, a lot of people don't say they didn't attend training or don't remember attending training. So there's probably opportunity there for education, opportunity to make recommendations about how to make people feel comfortable about coming forward to ask for advice, because there's a proportion of people that don't seem to feel comfortable asking for advice or aren't confident they're going to get a useful answer. So I think those are areas where we actually can make, the commission can make some recommendations about how to address that.
Okay, thank you.
And I think you look at this as like a thermometer or barometer, and it's basically, there's nothing horrendous showing up here, which is a good thing.
Tom?
Yeah, you had a number of charts about the experience they had when they brought complaints, whether it was positive, whether they felt threatened or intimidated, or were facing retaliation. That was the whole universe, wasn't it? Of people that,
That's
in other words,
no, that's people that actually report it.
right, but it includes people who reported it to the agency head and people who
Yes.
reported it to the IG. Is there any way of breaking it down to find out what the reaction was of the people who reported to the OIG?
Yes, we can do that. We'll make a note of doing that.
Thank you.
Any other questions for Dr. Cotton? If not,
Not a question, just a comment to build on John's point. I guess in the final, in addition to the end, will there be a note about what the appropriate sample size would be to make a question or response valid? Will there be any note on that, so that it's just not out in the wild without parameters around it? Is there any thought about that?
Yes, we can include some information about that.
okay, any other comments or questions?
Well, picking up again on what John had said, would it be possible to also include not only the N, but also to make a statement as to whether these things are statistically significant? I don't know if you need some kind of an expert to tell you that. I don't know. But my understanding is that a smaller sample size might be statistically significant in one case, but not in another, perhaps depending upon something about the answers. I don't really understand it myself.
It depends on the population size, the number of respondents, and the distribution of the responses.
Right. So if it depends in part upon the distribution of the responses, that would mean that even if, say, 10 people respond to each question, in some cases, it could be statistically significant, and in other cases, it could not be. Do I understand that correctly?
In a very high level answer, yes, it could be, because if the population was only 15 and we had responses for all 15, but really the issue is how representative the sample is of the population as a whole.
Yeah. Okay.
But I think that when you have really small ends, you really need to be careful about making major statements about them. They're just indicative. It's like at that point, it's more indicative of it's giving you information, but it's not a statistical statement that you can predict with.
John?
And I guess I also asked this question of my fellow commissioners and the chair. Is it reasonable to ask you to try and highlight for us what you think are the most relevant, statistically supportable findings? You've done a little of that, and the more you talk about it, the more I understand. Like when you say, look, no matter how many people reported their interaction with the office, if the majority of them found that to be a good interaction, to me, that sounds meaningful, right? I mean, it would be nice to have more, but that sounds meaningful. And yet others of these, like the one I mentioned potentially about the agencies, happy or sad or ethical or unethical, I get concerned about that for the reasons that I described earlier. So, perhaps since you know the data so well, and you also understand, even if you're not doing a detailed analysis of the numbers against whatever standards, and I don't know that that's reasonable to ask you to do. I just wonder if you can it would be helpful to me if other people feel like they can go through this themselves and sort of say this struck me or that struck me. That's obviously fine too, but I'd appreciate anything you can do to try and highlight for us those things that you think might be, conclusions that are meaningful conclusions, statistically or otherwise.
Yes, we can do that.
Thank you.
Okay. So I'll ask one more time, perhaps someone else, you've been moved to a question or a comment. If not, let me thank you again, Dr. Cotton, for your presentation. A lot of information that I think we will be able to make some use of. And we are grateful that those persons who are part of the Baltimore County government community had that as one of their opportunities to make their voices heard and to give us some idea of the ethical climate within Baltimore County government. And so thank you for that.
Thank you.
And so we're going to move on to the next report, and that's findings of best practices. And that research was led by Dr. Sarah, who is the research manager of the Schaefer Center for Public Policy. And so Dr. Fitzimet, we'll turn this over to you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you everyone for having us today to report on the best practices research. So just as a reminder, our methodology was we first identified all the offices of Inspector General or kind of similar in the US at the local and state levels. We used internet searches, news searches, and of course used the list on the Association of Inspector General's website. We then developed the list of proposed questions. We've called it variables as well that will guide the research. And we gave the members of the commission a chance to weigh in on those and add several to them. We then reviewed a whole lot of legislation, all the legislation for these offices and ethics commissions when we could find that. We looked at websites for the offices, for the ethics commissions, for the jurisdictions themselves, and we looked through other sources such as news and other information to try and find the answers to these questions. In some cases, we did contact selected offices of the Inspector General to obtain information that was not otherwise available online. I will say we received a few callbacks on that, but not as much as we would have liked. The only other thing is to note that the results on the slide and in the report show how many OIGs were found to have a specific characteristic. As we got into it, there was so much, in some cases, the information was just not available, and we didn't feel comfortable saying for sure that, you know, these OIGs did not have a certain thing unless it was something we could find out. But a lot of times they will not say, for example, when we ask about if they have, or when we're looking for if they have law enforcement authority, nothing in their enabling legislation usually, or on their website will say, we do not have law enforcement authority. So we pretty much wanted to report more on what we could affirmatively find. And we are hoping to continue to make some phone calls to try and get more information as this goes forward, but we did want to get you as much as we could now because you will start thinking about more about what the recommendations and everything from the commission will be. So to start with, we found 106 offices of Inspector General. This number I want to note may differ from other counts for several reasons. One is there's a few jurisdictions, most notably New York City and Florida, where there is a central office of Inspector General that oversees the offices of Inspector General in different departments. We only included that as one because there's the central overriding one that does training that kind of manages the others. So in some cases, you could increase, say, the local counts of those in local governments by quite a bit if you separated out those New York City ones. Or conversely, in Florida, if you separated out the Florida ones to where they have them in many, many departments, you could increase that number by quite a bit. We just felt it was better because they follow the same policies counted that way. We, as I mentioned last time, we did not include National Guard units, but there are a lot of those at the state level, but they generally are following federal military guidelines and processing. So we, those would be federal decisions. And finally, there's just a lot of state and local agencies that are similar to offices of Inspector General, but they're not called offices of Inspector General. We didn't include them here either because we're looking officially at OIGs. And so when you break these down, you can break them. We broke them down in two ways. One, we wanted to separate out if OIG was local, and that's a city or a county, or if it was at the state level. And then we wanted to break them down by if they have control. We called it general government. It wasn't always the whole of government. Oftentimes it was only executive branch agencies. It might be only general fund agency programs or agencies funded by the general fund. In one case, it's legislative, but so they have a more overarching oversight role. Then you have a lot of OIGs that are responsible only for a certain department or a certain program. And so here's our 106 OIGs broken down into those 4 categories. And you can see local general government, we found 37 Office of Inspector General. And of course, this, as I said, includes that New York City one. And underneath that, we found 5 that were local for department or program. For the state, it was the reverse pattern. State general government OIGs, there were about 12 of them, and department or program, there were 52. So you can see there's a very clear pattern. Local OIGs tend to have a general government role. State OIGs tend to be more focused on a specific department or program. So we looked first at one of the basic things we looked at was when OIGs were created, and most of them have been created since 2000. I believe I talked last time, the one pre-1975 OIG is the New York City one that dates itself back to the late 1800s. But you can see there was quite most of these were formed in 2000 to 2020. In fact, the high point for, if you look in 5-year periods, was in 2010 to 2014. And so here, as in the rest of the slides, we call out the numbers that are local general government because that is most similar to what we're looking at with Baltimore County. And so you can see the 5-year period when the largest number of these was formed was 1990 to 1994. But there was also 6 of them, for example, in 2010 to 2014. You can see in 2000 to 2004, there were a lot of the State Department ones formed. And the 5-year period with the most was 2010 to 2014. One of the other things we want to look at to establish the beginnings was how were they created? And almost all of them we found were created through legislation, as was the Baltimore County OIG. 34 of the OIGs where we could learn where they were, how they were created were through legislation. Much smaller numbers through executive order or other ways. I believe there was a department secretary created one. There are a few other methods there. Oh, and I forgot to mention, all of the numbers we're presenting tonight do not include Baltimore County. We were trying to talk about all the others when we give you this information. Most of the OIGs we found were generally small. Most of them had fewer than 20 employees, and a lot, or several, about 9 had but 4 or fewer. You can see the local general ones tend to be smaller. There's 7 of them we found that had 1 to 4 employees, 3 had 5 to 9, and 8 had 10 to 19 employees. And we did find some that were State Department ones that had more than 100 employees. So some of these are quite large. We also looked at the number of years, staff by years since establishment. So on the vertical axis is the number of years since it's been founded. Across the horizontal is the number of staff. And you can see there is a relationship, but it's not very strong. It's not, there's a lot of clustering. So that's generally what it is. And we also just want to be clear, this shows that there might be a relationship. It does not show the direction of causation. So we can't say that the number of staff is due to the number of years. We then moved into looking at structural characteristics of the OIGs. A lot of the questions that we have, as the commission have discussed, fell into this area. And so the first one was, if very basic, do they have responsibility for investigations, audits, or both? And so audits and investigations are that investigations normally focus on obtaining factual evidence for use, whereas audits function as independent, objective assessments of an organization's operations. And as we know, Baltimore County Office of Inspector General can pursue investigations at their discretion, while the auditing function is assigned to the county auditor. So of the ones for which we could determine this, we found 49 of the OIGs have both audit and investigative powers. At the local general government level, again, the most aligned with Baltimore County, there were 18 of these 49. Local department program, 2 of them, state general government 6, and state department program 23. We affirmed it, we defined independence of action is if they can pursue cases proactively and without interference from those outside the office. And Baltimore County OIG does have this independence of action. They can pursue cases at their discretion. They don't need to wait for a complaint or other thing. They can initiate themselves. 31 of the OIGs have independent of action, including 19 of the local general government. We looked at confidentiality. That concerns an OIG's ability to safeguard data or information. And Baltimore County OIG can indeed provide confidentiality within some parameters concerning the law. But in general, they can keep this information confidential. We found 48 of the OIGs we looked at. We could affirmatively say that they can maintain confidentiality, usually the same language because they use it from the same best practices guidelines. But of the local general government ones we found, 28 of them can maintain confidentiality.
Excuse me, Sarah?
Yeah.
I was wondering if we see this in another form or in another copy of this, would it be possible if for each one of these columns, this goes for this whole series where we're seeing this chart here, if you could provide, for example, with local general government, not just to provide the number 28, but to provide either a percentage or remind in each time of the fact that it looks like there's 37. So here, for example, it looks like that would be 28 out of 37, which is obviously over half. But without that reminder of either a percentage or what the base number is, and as we skip from column to column, it's a little hard to track. You see what I'm saying? What these percentages are.
We can definitely do that. The concern was when we developed this was we just want to be clear that it just because we say, for example, 60% of the local general government, we found this for them. It's 40% doesn't mean that they don't have it. It just means we couldn't find it. So we can add the percentages with that caveat in there. And hopefully we can increase some of these numbers as we make phone calls and stuff. So definitely have to make that change, Cindy.
Thank you.
And please feel free to interrupt me if anybody has any other questions as we go on. There's a lot of information here. So the next one is if they had unrestricted access to materials. Again, this tends to be within the standards and policies, best practices. Unrestricted access to materials basically means just that they can request anything from sources deemed relevant to the scope or investigation of the audit. And the Baltimore County OIG has this ability. And of the ones we found, 53 of them, 27 local general government also have unrestricted access to materials like the Baltimore County OIG. One of the things that's come up is subpoena authority, which is basically the authority grants the OIG the ability to file a subpoena or to compel somebody to provide information, testimony, or otherwise. And as we know, Baltimore County OIG has subpoena authority, and so do over half of all of the OIGs we found, including 20 of the local general government. So one of the questions that's also come up related to this is if there's a waiting period before they can file subpoenas. As we know, there is one with Baltimore County. We didn't find a lot of information on this because it's a very internal process usually, but we did find evidence of subpoena waiting times that ranged from 72 hours down in a parish down in Louisiana to 90 days in Montgomery County.
May I ask you, I guess at some point it would be helpful to have the list, and I'm sure maybe the full report probably has the list of actual jurisdictions, but you know, when you, I guess I'm more concerned about being more like Montgomery County than a small parish in Louisiana, just in sort of the most general terms. So I wonder if we can get a sense when you're doing that sort of thing of Who? Are there other Maryland jurisdictions? Are they similar jurisdictions in terms of size or complexity? Because at some point we may address this question, which is 90 days a reasonable time? And we'll say, well, there's a range from 72 hours to 90 days. And to the extent that the type of jurisdiction is relevant, and it may not be, but to the extent that it is, it would be useful to understand whether jurisdictions more like Baltimore County have a particular rule than a different one.
We can consider how to put that information in the report, sure. The report itself does say that I do label the endpoints for this one of Jefferson Parish and Montgomery County. And I want to say that we only found like 4 maybe that had a waiting period, but we can add that information and try to find a way to add it in for other questions as well, if that would be helpful.
And to that point, if I may, when you say couldn't, I mean, I understand you're being asked to do a lot here. Can't find means not findable, means couldn't find within the constraints of the inquiry. I mean, I wonder because, you know, if for example, just using this because it's a bit of a math question or a numbers question. If we said, you know, it's really important to have better data on this, are there opportunities to go back, or are you basically saying, look, this is it, like this is as good as it's going to get?
We can make some phone calls. We intend to make some more phone calls to see if we can get the information. But to be honest, some of this is very internal that these offices don't like to share some of this information. Also, it's a lot of offices of Inspector General we were trying to find all this information on. And I'll be 100% honest, what would be really great would be for an organization to do a survey of all of the OIGs to get this information from all of them. It would have been really nice to be able to put together a survey to just have them answer these questions, because it just was beyond what the capability and beyond the scope, I believe too, in some ways, for what was supposed to be this part of the project.
Can you remind us, there's a national association, right? We've talked about, and I forget the name. What do they do? Don't they do this kind of stuff?
I'm not aware of them doing a survey like that.
Oh.
They do have the they do have standards and policies online, the Green Book.
Right, the Green Book, yeah.
And they will be at the next meeting as well.
Okay.
So they can talk to some of these things, most of these things, I'm sure.
Right. Thanks again.
Actually, a point to add to that, if there are particular questions that we want them to address, we have sent them questions to address, but if anything comes up from tonight specifically that we want them to address, we can send that to them and ask that they address that in their presentation.
Okay. So we looked at law enforcement authority, which again comes up as a frequent thing that OIGs have. It's basically they have the power of police or peace officers, and they can handle guns and things of that nature. Baltimore County OIG does not have this, and most of the ones that we looked at did not have this as well. For this one, in a lot of cases, if they aren't showing here as having it, they probably don't, because they would list this in their enabling legislation, but we didn't always have access to that legislation. Only 4 of the local general governments do, so you can see this, at least as we found it so far, rare. So then we looked at financial independence. This just means that an agency's funding is not subject to executive or legislative adjustment, or it's set in legislation. It's mandated, not discretionary. The Baltimore County OIG does not have financial independence. It's part of the annual budget process, and it's fully at the discretion of the county exec and county council. Most OIGs we did not find have financial independence. We found only 6 that have that, and the report does include what kind of examples that are there. We found, for example, in Chicago, the OIG gets 0.14% of all appropriations. In Jacksonville, Florida, they get a minimum funding of $400,000, and it expressly notes they can ask for more. And New Orleans OIG gets 0.55% of the general fund. And in Tallahassee, the OIG gets no less than 0.8% of the general fund. But those are the only 4, again, that we found that have a mandated budget amount. We looked at oversight, what kind of oversight different OIGs have, and this is just the mechanism mechanisms by which they're directed and given direction. The Baltimore County OIG we found is subject to quality assurance reviews by an independent organization every 3 to 5 years. But we didn't find any other, there's not really any other oversight besides the ability of the county executive and county council to remove the IG for cause, which I'll talk about in the next slide. We did find 43 OIGs total have some kind of method of oversight. 21 are of the local general government do. And generally oversight takes the form of the IG serving at the pleasure of a elected chief executive or legislative body or department's leadership. The oversight sometimes was also conducted by Office of Human Resources or personnel review committees, generally the same process that any county employee would be subject to. And in a few cases, they have oversight by the independent group, such as the Association of Inspector General's peer review process, like Baltimore County. So for removal process, IGs are usually appointed for a set term, but a removal process means there's a way to remove them outside of the end of that term. As I mentioned, the Baltimore County OIG can be removed by the county executive for cause and with approval from the county council. 59 of the OIGs had a removal process, including 28 local general government. Most cases, the IG can only be removed for cause, but there are many examples of removal authority being subject to an official's discretion. They may also be removed. The most common removal process are through votes by the legislature, whether that's a city, county council, or a state legislature. And then we looked at ethics commitments. Government ethics, they take a lot of forms, they do a lot of work, and I'll talk about that in a few minutes. With regard to Maryland, as we know, we've discussed, the Baltimore County Inspector General serves as the executive director of the County Ethics Commission and does the staff work related to it. We found 71 of the jurisdictions also have an ethics commission, including 26 of the general government ones. And most of those we were able to find were operationally independent. So of the 26 local general government OIGs and ethics commission jurisdictions with both an OIG and an ethics commission that we found, 18 of those 26 were the two entities were operationally independent. They did not have staff, share staff, did not share leadership, did not share location. And we also looked at if they have, how many staff they have, and if the staff are paid by any other agency. And that information is in the report. Finally, we created a variable for overall OIG independence. So we've discussed independence and how it's defined a few times. And this was a way to kind of summarize probably the 3 main measures we found with regard to their independence. And so it describes the operational independence of an OIG. It's the financial independence. Again, if the budget is mandated or discretionary, if they have independence from oversight, and if there's independence of action, which again means they can pursue investigations without having to be spurred by something specifically. If they met all 3 of those criteria, they have high independence. They meet 2, they're medium independent, and if they meet 1, they're low. We found that the Baltimore County OIG has a medium level. It met 2 of the requirements. There's limited executive oversight statutorily, but it has the discretion to pursue their own cases, but does not have financial independence. And you can see for the ones that we were able to classify, we've found that 54 of them, the greatest share, had low overall independence. Same with local general government, 12 of those. We did find 4 that had a high overall independence. Again, they had freedom of financial independence, they had the freedom with oversight, and they had the freedom of independence of action. All 4 of those were local general government OIGs.
Sarah, do you happen to remember, in the case of financial independence, what methodology was used? Is it just a fixed amount, or do you recall how that's achieved?
Yes, that would be if in the usually in the enabling legislation, if it said the Office of Inspector General will get X% of the general fund or of all appropriations, or if that's financial independence. And not financially independent would be just subject to the regular appropriations
Right.
process. So they can have their funding cut in retaliation or increased for just if maybe they're finding in a certain way. Are there any
Right.
other questions on these ones, the structural ones? Okay. We then looked at some policies and procedures that have come up to see where we could find more information. And this was harder to find than many of those other ones. So the numbers generally are lower here. One is we just wanted to look at what are the sources for standard operating procedures. We hear references to several of these. I'm not sure they've been defined in some of our meetings, but the Green Book is the principles and standards for offices of Inspector General that was developed by the Association of Inspector Generals. This is what the Baltimore County OIG uses. There's also the Yellow Book. This was the generally accepted government audit standards by the Government Accountability Office, the federal GAO. Sometimes there's references to the Red Book, which is the International Professional Practices Framework by the Institute of Internal Auditors. And then there's the Blue Book. That is governmental accounting, auditing, and financial reporting by the GFOA, Government Finance Officers Association. So you can see, as I said earlier, Baltimore County uses the Green Book because they do investigations. About almost 30 of the OIGs for which we could identify this use the Green Book. That would also match with the shares that are doing investigations. In general, fewer do audits. So the numbers for the Yellow Book, the Red Book, and the Blue Book are lower, but there is still some use of those materials. The issue of independent legal counsel has come up as well. And so we looked into that. This is just if there's attorneys that work on staff or contractually to provide legal guidance to the OIG and represent the OIG in court if needed. As we know, the Baltimore County OIG does not have independent legal counsel. It's represented by the county attorney as needed. We did find 24 of them, of the OIGs did have independent legal counsel, including 11 of the local general government. We looked into advisory boards. So advisory board is just a group that advises the OIG, just helps them with the general operations, provides guidance and feedback. Baltimore County OIG does not have an independent advisory board. We only found 14 OIGs that did. And so these would be also to note formal advisory boards where there's memberships available. It's quite possible an OIG has an informal advisory board of people that they just talk to about things, and I would assume Baltimore County does as well. We looked at required trainings. So all government employees take a lot of trainings, including ethics trainings, as we discussed earlier tonight. New employees in the Baltimore County OIG, just as far as we know, are required to complete just the new employee orientation. They do have modules on diversity, bias, and inclusion, which are specific trainings that were mentioned previously in a previous meeting as of interest. But we don't know of any other known trainings specific to the OIG beyond the AIG, Association of Inspector Generals credentialing. We did find 61 OIGs require training. Most of these are just simply the required training of a government employee in their jurisdiction. We really didn't find any specific requirements for OIG specifically to undertake things such as diversity, bias, or inclusion trainings. However, most governments nowadays, when you do the new employee orientation, do have information on things such as diversity, implicit bias, and ethics. We were also asked to look into policies with respect to conflict. There's a couple different kinds of conflicts. That could be conflicts, interpersonal conflicts. It could be conflicts of interest. But basically looking to see if we could find policies that outlined what would happen in these instances. We don't know of any specific policies like this with regard to the Baltimore County OIG, and we didn't find a lot. We only found 9 OIGs that have some kind of conflict policy, and that includes 5 local general governments that did. The final one, in this section was time available for responses to draft reports. So this just provides, in the Baltimore County's case, the chief administrative officer, the chance to respond to what has been produced in a draft report in case there's clarifying information that can be provided or other information. And the OIG provides 2 weeks initially for the response to draft reports and has made extensions upon request. We couldn't find a lot of information about this. We only found 3 state department or program OIGs that had information available about the time for responses to draft reports. So again, if we have the chance to do phone calls and things, this would be one of the things to definitely look into, because it's a very internal process. The final thing we wanted to look at was every Maryland county is required by state statute to have an ethics commission. So we wanted to put together a little information on that, so we could consider the Baltimore County Ethics Commission as well, just to help outline that a bit more. So we identified a few different areas that we were interested in looking at. And one is if it operates as an independent agency. We found 9 counties where the Ethics Commission is independent. It does not fall into, it's not like co-located with the OIG or other agencies. And we know Baltimore County's Ethics Commission is not independent. We found 5 county ethics commissions that receive financial support independent of other organizations. Baltimore County's Ethics Commission does not. Its financial support comes through the OIG appropriation. And then we looked into duties that Baltimore County's Ethics Commission does, or that come up frequently when we were looking at others. One is how many handle employee financial disclosures, and you can see we found 19 of the 24 handle this, including along with Baltimore County Ethics Commission. So again, sorry, the base number of here is actually 23 because we're not including Baltimore County. So it would be 23 counties, as including Baltimore City as well, since it's county equivalent. We found 8 of the counties offer ethics training or similar, as does Baltimore County. 15 of them provide opinions on ethical issues, as does Baltimore County. 19 hears complaints about suspected ethics violations, so does Baltimore County. And only 4 investigate suspected ethical violations, which Baltimore County does not. And so that is my presentation on best practices. Any further questions? I'm happy to try and answer them.
I have a question about the, if this will be included, is the size of the actual population of the organization that it supports. So if you have that.
We did try and gather that information. There were some limits on what was available. We do have a few areas where we are interested in expanding, that we didn't have time to get to. And one of them is looking at, in addition to the relationship between size of the OIG and how long it's been in operation, would be something similar to that. The challenge is also, we would want the OIG's budget or staff compared to what they can oversee. So probably, so that just requires digging in a little bit more into finding what the comparative number would be. But we do hope to do that, yes.
Thank you.
Are there other questions or comments for Sarah? Okay, so hearing none, I want to thank you, Dr. Fitznett, for the information that you shared as well. And I'm sure that it will go a long way to informing us as we move forward in the work that we are doing. And so we will move forward. Our 2 subcommittees started their work this month, and they will be continuing meetings during the month of September. The subcommittees, of course, are moving a bit slower than we had planned, reasons that are not of their own making, but they are moving forward, and we're grateful to you for that. And so I want to thank the chairpersons, Judge Cox and General Burkett, for the great work that your committee is doing, and thank each of the committee members for your continued work. And so with that being said, do any of the commission members have any other commission business to discuss? Or any questions going forward? No? Okay. So if not, Ann or Sarah, do you have anything else before I move to adjournment?
No, we have the questions and comments that have been brought up, so we'll make sure that we address those.
Okay, thank you. Thank you again. So on behalf of County Executive Washewski and the citizens of Baltimore County, I want to take this opportunity to thank the members of the commission for volunteering your time and expertise to carry out this important work. And if there are no additional comments or questions from commission members, then I will ask for a motion to adjourn. Before we do that, I'm sorry, let me just, before we do that, our next meeting is scheduled for September 13th at 5:30 p.m. and it will be held again on Zoom. You can register to attend that meeting and all future commission meetings on our website at blueribbonethics.ubalt.edu. We are tentatively scheduled to hear from an academic expert on offices of Inspector General, that person being Dr. Robin Kempf of the University of Colorado Springs. She is the author of the book, The Power of Accountability, Offices of Inspector General on the State and Local Levels, that was published in 2020. And we also plan to hear from the leadership of the National Association of Inspectors General, Mr. Gregory Hill, who is the Executive Director, and Mr. Stephen Street, the President, who is also the State Inspector General for the state of Louisiana. And so with that being shared, can I get a motion to adjourn?
I move that we adjourn.
Thank you. May I have a second?
Second.
And with that, the meeting is adjourned. Thank you so very much and have a great night.